Good evening, my Lynn and Things family and friends. Happy Saturday evening to you. Guys, it's Saturday, and so what does that mean? It is story time with Lynn. Yes, we're going to pick up on our next chapter in the story of Miss Tyson. I think we are on chapter 13 now, guys. I hope you guys are enjoying these readings every weekend. It is really a joy to bring her story to you guys. Of course, not reading all of every chapter, but just some of the highlights and points that I'd like to share with you guys. And I love hearing you guys' commentary in the comments. So please feel free to share whatever thoughts that you have for the readings. Like if something came to mind, or if a memory came to you, or you just had a quote, anything you want to put down in the comments. I love you guys' commentary. But before we get into reading, y'all know we have to set the ambiance. And so to do that, I'm going to be lighting my candle. So the candle of the evening, guys, is going to be my sand and fog. I don't know if you can see that. And it is a crisp white scent. Ooh, it kind of makes me think of like fresh laundry. So we're going to get that nice and lit, and then we're going to get started on our reading. Okie dokie, guys. So we got our ambiance going. However you would like to enjoy this, please feel free to get nice and comfy. If you want to go get yourself a drink, something nice and warm. Where I am, it's a little cool. Fall has really come in. I mean, it's cool. So it's like some cocoa would really be nice right now, or a cup of tea. However you want and whatever you would like to do as you sit and you listen to our next chapter of Just As I Am, the Cicely Tyson story. And remember, I'm just reading highlights, not every single page. Okay, guys? Because I don't own the rights. We do want people to still be able to purchase the book if they would like to. So here we go. And thank you so much, Subbies, for coming in. Here we go. The title of chapter 13 is 1968. Miles could make me laugh so hard I nearly choked to death. Every time we sit down for dinner, he'd start up with his crazy stories. I never knew where his tales would go. A few of them made me cringe, like the one about a friend he called Third Story Joe, so named for his skill in scaling buildings to rob them. While others made me curious. During Miles's childhood, his mother, when hosting ladies' lunches, counted out her guests' peas before serving them. Regardless of the memory shared, whether it was relishing his early years as Little Davis in Charlie Parker's quintet, or recounting how his beloved father once locked him in his guest house in an effort to help Miles break his drug habit, cold turkey. Every one of his accounts, by the end, had me doubled over. There was something about Miles' storytelling, peppered with color and lacking in pretense. That inevitably choked me up. One evening, after semi-successfully avoiding the bones in the fish soup, I slammed my spoon down and yelled, "You trying to kill me? Why don't you tell me these stories when I'm not eating?" He was so full of the devil, that Miles. What an incredible sense of humor and style. Miles, like my father, was a dapper Dan, a certified stepper. He had an Italian tailor, Mario, who dressed him to the hilt. In the 1960s, men's fashions was exactly as I preferred it. Slim-fitting suits, complemented with thin ties and thin lapels, thin collars, clean and perfect for Miles's sweat figure. Whenever the two of us turned up, boy, we turned some heads. I beamed at his side, glamorous in my couture, showing off my looks by style mavens such as Arthur McGee, the first black designer to ever run a studio. I felt proud to stand alongside Miles, loved folding my silk gloved hands into his strong ones. I knew sooner or later one of the big boys would sweep you off your feet, Warren would tease me. Like Ossie and Ruby, Miles and I were among a handful of black power couples of the 60s, an artistic duo that drew stares. Once, when he and I were out at a dinner concert, a well-known singer, I won't name, glided over to our table after she had performed. "You've got the prize, Miss Cicely," she told me. Around town, everyone knew she'd been salivating over Miles for years. She then turned to him and said, "And I can't tell you how lucky you are." I smiled and pulled up my sequin wrap more snugly around my shoulders. One of the most cherished fashion staples was a gift from Miles. He once called up a renowned designer and said to him, "I want you to make Cicely a fur coat." "I don't make fur coats," the man told him. Miles repeated his statement, the second time adding, "And I want it here on December 24th. Sure enough, by noon on Christmas Eve, an erroneous brown paper bag sat in the middle of Miles's living room floor. "What's that?" I asked. "Well, open it and see," he said, a glint of mischief in his eyes. I lifted out the floor-length stunner and gasped. In the following years, I wore that mink out. Do you hear me? And whenever I donned my Cadillac of coats, others gawked and exchanged looks and glances. I basked in the glory and the gaze. That was the 60s, a peculiar combination of fashion and frivolity, protest and profound social turmoil. The decade in our America bore varied expressions, each seared in my memory as deeply as those of Miles's many faces. The era radiated with ethnic pride, as Black Panthers donned kente cloths and proclaimed "Black is beautiful." It spat back at its oppressors, with the Black Power movement insisting upon change by any means necessary. It throbbed and ached, drooping its head low after the church bombing in Birmingham and the assassinations of JFK and Malcolm X. It clenched its jaw and clutched its fist, chanting "Mississippi," Nina Simone's anthem in response to Medgar Evers' murder. With freedom rides and demonstrations, Watts riots and urban uprisings, the 60s raised its voice even as it stiffened its spine. And then, in the spring of 1968, as the decade screeched toward its close, it let out a primal wail. That April, Miles and I were on a tour stop in Seattle. Anytime Miles was on the road, he never wanted to go out for lunch or dinner, preferring always to preserve his energy for his performances. So in the kitchen of the apartment we stayed in, I fixed us something to eat while he sat in the living room talking on the phone with his attorney, Harold. When their conversation ended, he laid down the phone and he looked over at me. "Harold said they shot King," he said. I continued stirring my pot of broth, feeling sure that, as usual, Miles was joking. I was just about to blurt out, "Now that's not funny," when he delivered the remainder of his sentence. "And he's dead." I folded like an accordion, my body turning in on itself as I faltered to my knees. The words, a penetrating dagger, stabbed me right in my solar plexus. "What?" I asked. "What did you just say?" "King has been assassinated," Miles told me. "He's gone." I will always be amazed at how a singular occurrence can break open the soul of the world. One moment you stirring your wooden spoon through a saucepan, lost in the aroma of savory bouillon, oblivious to what awaits. The next moment, a simple turn of the spoon later, you are down on the cold linoleum, arms cradled around yourself, numbed into silence, weeping. On the evening the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was gunned down on the second floor of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, the earth rocked and quaked, and then, all at once, it splintered into two. The suddenness of the shift, the wrenching pain of it all was, for me, soon followed by a personal gut punch. A few years before King's death, life sent me another hard lesson in surviving as a black actress. I had received a call from Elia Kazan, a renowned Greek-American theater director. He and Robert Whitehead co-founded the Repertory Theater at Lincoln Center, which in 1964 opened its temporary home in Greenwich Village, while its permanent home was the Vivian Beaumont Theater at Lincoln Center, was being constructed. Even before Elliot called me, I'd heard that he and Robert were casting for their upcoming productions. I'd also heard that some of the industry's black organizations had been pressuring him to cast at least one African American actor. He'd relented by bringing in two light-skinned performers, men so pale you had to kind of squint to even know that they were black. "Can't you find a black female actress?" Elliot had been asked. He claimed he didn't know any, which is when he was given my number. He rang and invited me to come by his office. The meeting started out pleasantly enough. "I've heard quite a bit about you," he said, smiling. "Tell me more about yourself." I explained how I'd gotten into the business and where I studied and what I enjoyed most about my work in the blacks. The conversation flowed quite easily, and before we knew it, an hour had gone by. "I find you very interesting," he says, "but unfortunately, I have to leave for an appointment. Can we meet again tomorrow?" I agreed and returned the next afternoon for another equally delightful chat. "You know something," I said near the close of our meeting. "I'd like to ask you a question." He nodded and sat up at his desk. "Why aren't there any black women in the company?" I asked. "Cicely," he said bluntly, "I have to tell you this. When a black woman walks across the stage, the audience's mind turns to sex." I stared at him, absolutely dumbstruck by what he told me. To this moment, I cannot believe, even if he believed what he was saying, he'd be insensitive enough to actually say it to a black woman. And not only did he say it, he uttered it casually, without even a hint of self-consciousness. This man was considered the foremost director of his time, and he was admitting, openly professing, that he deprived me of a job because of a long-held stereotype? Well, you know something? I got up from that chair, I walked out of that man's office, and I never returned. I later heard that the company eventually brought in Ethel Ayler, the talented and gorgeous black actress who'd once replaced Abby Lincoln in The Blacks. I can only imagine what that poor woman endured. Elijah was eventually fired from his post and replaced, amid rumors that he'd clandestinely blacklisted actors during the Communist Red Scare of the 1950s. I was on set filming when the country suffered yet another body blow. A lone gunman shot Robert F. Kennedy, then running for president. The world gasped in unison, as it did a day later when he died at Good Samaritan Hospital in Los Angeles. Only 2 short months before we had lost King. Most black folks in the country saw RFK as the remaining hope, a candidate intent on extending King's quest for civil rights. Here was a man who promised to end a deeply controversial war overseas in Vietnam, who had promoted equality for black Americans who had not yet granted first-class citizenship here. This was precisely Muhammad Ali's point when he refused in 1967 to serve in the war and said, "I ain't got no quarrel with them." King's murder had been devastating on its own, but when Bobby was assassinated, that devastation morphed into delirium. There was a sense, as there is in our times now, that the country had come undone. In July 1968, right after the 1-2 punch, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter premiered in New York. Miles and I showed up on the red carpet together, an image of us yellowed by time but forever stashed in my box of memories, brings to mind the feeling of that era. Miles's arms are folded across his body, his eyes covered with sunglasses. I, wearing a simple sleeveless dress, stand near him, with one hand clutching my pocketbook, the other resting on his hand. A pair of silver chandelier earrings swirl from my lobes toward my shoulders, like two large teardrops. We both peered blankly into the camera lens, our bodies present in the room, our spirits far away. When I look at that photo now, it reminds me of the stillness of those months following Dr. King and RFK's murders, of the quiet and the questioning that befall you once a casket has been lowered into the ground. We were there to celebrate the opening of a film, and still we were inwardly weeping. A few weeks after the premiere, Miles gave me yet another reason to grieve. One afternoon I was relaxing in his living room on the ground floor while he was upstairs in the bedroom. The doorbell rang, and when I opened the door, there stood a light-skinned young black woman with straight hair cascading down her back. She stared at me. This is the woman, I thought. I immediately recognized her as the lady I had seen in my vision months before. The one who sat at Miles's side as he sped up 7th Avenue in his white Ferrari. Before I could speak, Miles, who had heard the bell, came down the stairs into the door. He looked at me and then at her, and then back at me. He pushed past me, ushered the woman away from the entrance, and shut the door behind him. I stood there, jaw on the ground, scrambling to make sense. What just occurred? I'd heard the talk that Miles was fooling around with some woman by the name of Betty Marbury, a model and musician 19 years younger than he was. The circle of black entertainers was tiny in those days, and even smaller in the world of Castellan, our parlor. 2 seconds after juice had slipped from someone's lips, that OJ had slid his way out the door and across town. I'd never seen the woman, but both Finney and Frenchie had spotted her. She had the nerve to start having her hair done down at Castellan, and on several occasions she and Miles had been seen sniggling and giggling as they left there together. She struts in there acting like she's Mrs. Miles Davis, I'd heard. I never asked Miles about the rumors, in part because I did not believe they were true, and in part because I loved Miles so. But I never forget a face, and once Betty stood across from me in Miles's doorway, one truth was irrefutable. This was the woman I had foreseen. I stood there for only a moment. Miles and this woman were hardly down the block by the time I stormed from his place and back to my own a few streets away. Once home, I pulled out a large suitcase, lifted it onto my bed, and opened it. I packed up everything Miles had ever given me. The shoes, the dresses, the jewelry, the mink coat, the items reeking of guilt that had prompted their purchase. An hour later, I hauled a taxi and loaded that suitcase in the trunk. Please take me around the corner to 312 West 77th, please, I told the driver. Upon arrival, I hauled that suitcase to Miles's door and rang the bell. I didn't know whether he had been back home, and I did not care. Either way, I had a message to deliver. He opened the door. I pushed past him and hurled that suitcase into the air. It landed with a thud a few feet from Betty, who stood there looking dumbfounded, like she just witnessed the second coming. Before either of them could speak, I bolted off. The next week at the salon, word of our split had of course made its way to Frenchie. He'd heard that after I'd thrown that suitcase and marched away, Miles had gone absolutely berserk. Betty, upset that Miles had been giving me lavish gifts while secretly courting her, told her friends that she'd never seen Miles more angry. Angry? If anybody had a right to fury, it was me. Miles had been strutting all over town with this woman, obviously with no care about mortifying me, and plainly with no fear of reprisal. As much as I cared for Miles, as deeply as I understood the hurt-filled past that plagued him, I would not allow him to blatantly disrespect me. Still, in those days after I discovered his affair, I felt more numb than indignant, more wounded than furious, more somber than upset. If he wanted this woman, then he could have her, but he could not have us both at once. And clearly, he did want her, because soon after our debacle, and around that time Miles' divorce from Frances became final. He married Betty in the autumn of 1968. Yes, Jesus loves me because he sent me an exit ramp out of the country. That fall, with my emotions still raw, I landed a small recurring role in a Canadian television series. I don't recall the show's name right now, only that it became a lifeline for me. I packed my sorrows alongside my toiletries and I flew on to Toronto, channeling my sadness into my role, soothing myself the way I had during my childhood, over the keys of a piano. For most of autumn, I was away from the salon chatter, away from the misery swirling around the situation, away from Miles, whom I did not speak to after I flung that suitcase into his world. Years later, we'd again cross paths for Act 2 of our story. With God, what God had in mind for me was a new chapter. In 1968, I'd suffered another devastation when Warren Coleman died suddenly. He'd always had a major ambition to build a thriving black film company, which is what had led him to direct Carob Gold. Once that effort floundered, he moved back to his hometown of Boston, where his brother Ralph was directing the Negro Federal Theater of Massachusetts. He worked alongside Ralph even as he applied for an endowment to fund his own dream. When he opened the envelope and read that he'd received the substantial endowment he'd requested, he found the news so astonishing, so unbelievable for a black man during that era, that he suffered a massive heart attack. While still reeling from that stunning tragedy, I found another agent, but didn't take to her too well. She was always cutting me off in meetings. I moved on quickly. Somehow or another, I found my way to Bill Haber, whom I called Haber for short. Haber was based in California, the place where my path next carried me. Jimmy Comack, the actor and producer, asked me through Haber to star in an episode of The Courtship of Eddie's Father, an ABC sitcom Jimmy created. The episode, titled Guess Who's Coming for Lunch, involved a setup between my character, Betty, and Tom, played by Bill Bixby. Jimmy flew me to Los Angeles for filming. I stayed with Haber and his wife, Carol, in the Hollywood Hills. Each morning he rose early and slid the call sheet under my door, and after a few days I'd done what I had to do. On my last afternoon in town, I stopped by the ABC lot to thank Jimmy. He must have been impressed with me because he said, "Don't go. You don't belong in New York City. You belong here." He then mentioned that he'd seen a black woman on the lot that day, and that must mean they're looking for a black character, he said. "Come with me." He walked me to an adjacent studio where he disappeared down the hall as I waited. A half hour later, he returned with the director, who was casting for the hospital drama medical center. The series' first episode was to feature O.J. Simpson, and the director was looking for an actress to play O.J.'s wife for one episode. I auditioned that very day and landed that part. Even before I could ring Haber with the news, Jimmy had already called him and persuaded him that I should remain in town. "But where will I stay?" I asked Haber. When I returned to his place that evening, "You can stay here with us," he said without hesitation. I didn't know it at the time, but Haber hadn't yet informed Carol, whose second son, Quinn, was still an infant. Haber walked me into the kitchen where Carol was feeding little Quinn in his high chair. "Carol, Cicely's going to be staying with us for a while," he told her. She nodded and forced a half smile, but she didn't say much. Can you blame her? The nerve of Bill Haber to march me in there without first talking to his wife. Haber showed me to my space downstairs in their multi-level home. I had a private floor with its own entrance, he explained, and I thanked him profusely. Haber's invitation for me to stay a while turned out to be 9 years, on and off. I never gave up my apartment or life back east. New York will always be my home, my foundation, the place where I feel rooted by loved ones and community. But starting in 1969, I became bi-coastal. I'd fly into Los Angeles, do a roll, then fly back to New York City. The Habers became my second family. In fact, even when they moved to the Pacific Palisades during the 70s, they asked me to move with them. Given the rumors that swirled during my time there, it's a wonder that they let me stay. While I was living with the Habers, the world seemed convinced that Haber and I were having an affair. I can assure you we were not. For one thing, the idea of it just plain is ludicrous. And for another, he wasn't my type. I have always preferred black men. Yet in those days, if I so much breathed in the direction of any man, it was assumed that I was seeing him. Even back when I was in the blacks, folks seemed sure I was carrying on with Sidney Bernstein, one of the producers, though the two of us were just friends. One night when he was walking me home, he said, "You know, someone asked me if we were having an affair." I screamed. Sidney was as old as Jesus then, probably around 80. "Well, what did you say, Sidney?" I asked him. I said, "Of course. Do you think I'm going to say no?" And I cracked up laughing. A few years into my time with the Haber family, Bill took me to dinner. "Carol thinks we're having an affair," he said bluntly. I just laughed. Not just because I was amused by such foolishness, but because they'd both witnessed the steady parade of suitors arriving at their home to take me out during that era. "That's not true," I said, smirking. He laughed and nodded, and she says her girlfriend heard that the three of us were having a menage a trois. I put down that fork and I stared at him. "Oh, Bill, please stop the nonsense," I finally said as we both burst into laughter. That summer I mentioned this to Carol. She and Bill had a place in Paris, and every August they would invite me and a guest to join them. "Carol," I said as the two of us were preparing dinner one evening, "I hear you've always thought Bill and I were having an affair." She kind of glanced over at me. "Yeah," she said. "Carol, look at me," I told her. "Why in God's name would I be living in your house with you, Bill, and your children, and having an affair right under your nose? What is the matter with you?" She kind of smiled and shrugged. "What was I supposed to think?" she said, chuckling. "That's what everybody was saying all over town." Can you believe that? People's minds work in the strangest ways. Looking back on it now, I still shake my head when I recall that Haber had the audacity to ever waltz me into his house without first asking Carol whether I could live with them. Guess who's coming for lunch and then staying for nearly a decade? Me. Around New York, everyone knew I had been talking constantly about how to carry on Dr. King's legacy, how to move his dream from rhetoric to reality, asking ourselves the question that hovers above our nation now: what will be our part in the revolution? We were also easing the ache caused by King's tragic death, attempting to replace the emptiness and dream with a new sense of hope. Our leader had planted the seeds for change. We, those left holding his grand vision, were charged with ensuring its growth for future generations. Arthur Mitchell and I would talk on the phone for hours trading ideas. "Let's do this, let's do that. No, that won't work." Early one morning, a few weeks after we lost King, my phone rang and it was Arthur. "I've decided what we should do," he said excitedly. I rubbed my eyes and looked at the clock. "It's 3 a.m. "I'm going to form my own dance company," he went on, like it was noontime, "and I want you with me." The fervor in my friend's voice, the passion with which he spoke, dragged me from my bed. I washed my face and pulled on a trench coat over my PJs and took a cab over to his place just a few streets away. On Arthur's living room floor, amid papers and photographs he had assembled while brainstorming, we sat talking about how we could move his vision forward. "Wait a minute," he said after we'd been talking for an hour. "We need one more person to be in on this." "Who's that?" I asked. His face brightened up. "Let's get Brock Peters," he said. And out the door we went over to Brock's place a few streets over. Arthur pressed the buzzer, but nobody answered. We rang again. Finally, we heard Brock's sleepy voice over the intercom. "Who is it?" he asked. "It's Arthur and Cicely," Arthur announced. What's the matter?" Brock asked. "I'm going to form my own dance company," Arthur explained, "and I want you and Cicely to join me." Brock lumbered on down the stairs moments later. Once Arthur had persuaded him of the urgency of his idea, Brock threw on his coat and walked us to Arthur's apartment. There, with his eyes dancing, Arthur shared with us his vision. He dreamed of opening a classical ballet school, a place where black children, toes pointed, horizons expanded, could learn the rigors and discipline that he had lifted him toward prominence. He wanted to pass on to them the same gifts, the same dedication and work ethic that had carried each of us to that moment. More than anything, he wanted to awaken in them a dream, strong and pulsating, of a world beyond their own. Though poverty and prejudice surrounded them, it need not define them. A few hours later, the city stirred awake, and the three of us were still talking, still huddled in that circle with our hearts wide open. That is how Dance Theater of Harlem began more than 5 decades ago, in the wee hours with a trio of visionaries clustered together on a living room floor. All those years earlier, when I first met Arthur, he'd assured me we'd one day work together. That morning, as the sun peeked up over the horizon, my friend's dream took both flight and root. Anything Arthur asked me to do, I did. I co-founded the first board of directors, solicited grants, worked with renowned dressmakers like Zelda Wynn on costuming, taught a course about how to tell a story, graceful yet gripping, through dance. Lorenzo James, Arthur's longtime friend, was a critical part of our efforts. And though Arthur eventually brought in his Caucasian teacher, Carol Shook, a well-known ballet master, to partner with him in the venture, Shook is often miscredited with having co-founded Arthur's dance company. Frankly, that's no surprise. Since the days when ancient Greeks stole advanced concepts of architecture, philosophy, and mathematics right out of the palms of Africans, whites have been taking credit for black success, co-opting for ingenuity at every turn. But, to be clear, on the morning when Arthur, Brock, and myself formed the blueprint for the school, Shook was not yet even a thought. While he indeed contributed mightily later, it was Arthur, Brock, and I who first lifted Dance Theater of Harlem off the ground. And in between all the going and doing and launching, I served as Arthur's confidant, the friend who during our nightly phone calls lent an ear and moral support. Before long, Arthur had opened his doors to children from the Harlem neighborhood, charging them 50 cents a week for a place in history. At the outset, he had about 30 students. Arthur pushed every one of them to stand on their toes and reach past mediocrity toward a virtuosity the dance world has seldom witnessed. And in doing so, he defied the notion that black bodies were not made for classical ballet, that lines of our figures weren't suited for arabesques and pirouettes. During the summer of 1968, all of Harlem gathered, it seemed, to watch these gifted dancers arch their backs toward excellence. Harry Belafonte and Lena Horne were in attendance. So were Sidney, Ossie, Ruby, Maya, and scores of other notable artists. With every leap and grand jeté, their exacting standards became source of our shared pride. Dance Theater of Harlem quickly outgrew its original space, and by 1971, it had moved to its current quarters, a parking garage at 466 West 152nd Street. Arthur renovated the new space with a gift from Alva B. Gimbel. When Lorenzo invited Alva to observe the dancers, by then classes were being conducted in the basement of a church of the Master in Harlem, Alva declared, "These children should not be in a basement. They need a home of their own." On the spot, she wrote the dance company a check for $50,000. That same year, Arthur prepared his students to present 3 ballets at the Guggenheim. The mostly white audience applauded and was moved to tears. The group took its talents overseas soon after, performing in the Netherlands. Not only had Arthur, chief ambassador for black classical dance, preserved Dr. King's dream and made it international, he had gone so in lockstep with the black arts movement. Alongside poets and painters and singers and actors who protested not just with the picket signs, but through the mastery of their crafts, they believed, as Arthur and I did, in the unique transformative power of the arts. A well-told story, and whichever artistic medium it is delivered, can touch corners of the soul otherwise unreachable. Wow, guys, that very last sentence just gave me goosebumps because it made me think of my little one, my young daughter, all because like I made a move. I made a move when my girls were in middle school, I believe, and I moved to a better place where my girls could go to a school where they had more opportunities. And my child got into the arts and she fell in love with the arts, and to this very day she loves acting and singing and dancing. And so wow, I just love how they were able to begin the dance school in Harlem. Like just a dream, guys, just coming together. That really moved me. Thank you guys so much for joining me for this reading. Again, please feel free to put whatever comes to mind in the comments. Like I said, I love to be able to talk back and forth and hear from you guys. If you like this content, because like I am Lynn and I usually am doing Dollar Tree hauls or DIYs or something like that, this is a new segment here on Story Time with Lynn. If you like that or the Dollar Tree, please go ahead and hit that like and go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Thank you guys so much, and see you next Saturday for our next chapter.